Hi everyone, sorry I've been away for a bit, but I've had a nasty cold. I hope you're all doing okay. I want to say a little bit here about the rapier. So I am not primarily a rapier fencer by any stretch of the imagination. However, I have studied rapiers, the weapons themselves, in collections and so on over the course of the last decade or so, and I've also done some rapier fencing with friends of mine who are focused on that weapon. The specific thing that I want to say about the rapier is that it is not as seems to be commonly perceived amongst the non-historical fencing world. In other words, you know, people who maybe do role-playing games or like watching sword fighting in movies or whatever. It is not a particularly light weapon. So there seems to be a perception that the rapier is a very light dueling weapon. This is a complete misunderstanding of what the rapier really is. What the rapier is actually is a sword, a piece of steel that has been specialised for having a long blade and for thrusting with. That does not mean that it's lighter than another sword. So if I just grab the old medieval arming sword here, these weapons on average weigh about the same. They each weigh about 2.5 to 3 pounds usually. There are heavier examples and there are lighter examples. But all they've done with the rapier is they've taken the same amount of steel and essentially put it into a different shape. So you're dealing with the same mass at the end of the day. And what do you get for that development? Well, you get a developed hilt on the rapier, which is more protective to your hand. And you get a point of balance, which is generally speaking closer to the hand. And you get a longer, narrower blade. Because the blade is longer and narrower, it is generally speaking not anywhere near as good at cutting as a medieval style sword would be, or a sabre, or something else that's more of a cut and thrust sword. Although the rapier, or most types of rapier, there are some which can't really cut at all. There are some with very, very narrow blades, some with triangular section blades, which can't really cut, or can't cut to a noticeable degree. But most rapiers, the kind of average rapier, can cut to some extent, but they're only going to be fairly light flesh wounds, the kind of thing that will make you bleed a lot from the face, might open up a vein, might sever a tendon in your hand, this kind of thing. But they're never going to lop hands off or lop arms off or cut legs wide open so people can't use their legs. So it's really a thrusting weapon, and you've sacrificed that cutting potential, the power of the cut, to add extra length to your blade. And some of these rapiers have very, very long blades. In collections like the Wallace collection, for example, you can see rapiers which have 45, 48 inch blades, really, really long. You're talking about a blade which is actually as long as a big two-handed sword, but on a balanced one-handed sword. So they've got immense range and reach on them. However, as I repeatedly now mentioned, they are not anything like a fencing épée, which is what this is, an old épée, and even less like a foil. Okay, fencing foils were the practice weapons of small swords. Now, a small sword, whilst it developed from the rapier, is a very, very different thing from a rapier. Small sword generally only has a blade of about 30 inches long, as opposed to a rapier which has a blade of maybe 45 inches long. And the small sword is incredibly light and is really a specialised duelling weapon. The rapier, in contrast, was an all-purpose weapon. Yes, it was carried in civilian life, yes, it was used for duels, but it was also used on the battlefield. It was used sometimes by cavalry and very often by people fighting on foot, and it was carried by all sorts of soldiers, from pikemen to musketeers, which incidentally of course are people who use muskets, not people who run around fighting with swords all the time, up to you know, halberdiers, sort of town guards, all sorts of soldiers, artillery and so on, might carry a rapier. And if you look at the rapier fencing treatises, the manuals, you can see that the rapier is considered as both a personal defence civilian weapon and also a battlefield weapon, and that's just a given. Okay, and also if you look at the artwork from the period, you'll also see that the rapier is shown in civilian life and in military life. You know, the period that we're talking about of the true rapier is probably starting in the middle of the 16th century, around 1550, maybe a bit earlier, 1540. Debatably, the first real rapier treatise we have is by Camillo Agrippa in the 1550s, and then the rapier runs all the way through really to the sort of the second half, the middle of the second half of the 17th century. Okay, so it was really around for around 120, 130 years, and then after that, really the small sword started to take over as the gentleman's sword. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, during this period, there were other types of swords still in use. The long sword was still in use for the beginning part of the period. The basket-hilted broadsword and backsword was in use in the latter part of the period, and so on. So there we go. The main point I want to make is rapiers are not incredibly light duelling weapons. They are all-purpose swords that are specialised for the thrust, and they have a very long blade, but they weigh about the same as a medieval arming sword, a one-handed sword. They are much, much heavier than a fencing foil or fencing épée. Thank you.